R.J. Barrett, Garrett Temple, Norm Powell, Jonas Valanciunas, and others, as great as they were and as open and honest as they were, I think so many of the players that have since retired wanted to talk because they wanted to share their story.
I'm Nathan Maharaj. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guests are Eric Smith and Andrew Bricker, who together are the authors of We the Raptors, 30 players, 30 stories, 30 years. It's a feast of a book about Canada's only NBA team, the Toronto Raptors, who celebrate their 30th anniversary as the 2025 season gets underway. Eric, Andrew, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's not often that I get to speak with a sportscaster and a university literature prof. Certainly not about a shared creative project. So the first team that I need to ask you guys about is about you. How did this creative partnership come about?
Well, I think this starts with me. So the important backstory here is that Eric and I are brothers-in-law. So that's how we know each other. We've now known each other for a good 20 years. Both sports fans, chat Raptors, of course, and other things every time we got together. And during the COVID pandemic, I was having a little bit of a professor's crisis about, what do I work on next? I had a book come out in 2022, very academic, very not sports oriented. And I got to thinking, I love the NBA. I live in Belgium now. All of the games happen in the middle of the night. I would love to maybe return to that passion and actually write something about it. So I, in those back and forths during the pandemic, contacted Eric and pitched out the idea. I'll let Eric take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably a Zoom call similar to the one that maybe we're having, and just chatting back and forth with my wife, his sister, and with my son, his nephew, and the two of us ended up on the phone. And when Andrew kind of broached the idea of, have you ever thought about writing a book? I think my initial answer was straight up no. I hadn't really thought about it because in my brain, probably stupidly, I thought, well, that's something you do when you're either older or you're retired, especially I'm talking specifically with sports, when you're older or you're retired. And I was also, and I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, kind of either arrogant enough or dumb enough to think that he would meant like a book about me or my career or my thoughts on things, which clearly nobody would want to read, not at this point or maybe ever. So when we started to sort of flush out the idea of, well, what is it you actually mean? And if we actually did do this, what could it be? That took at least 6 months, if not a year, where I was sort of pushing the idea aside. And I think as we unfortunately got deeper into the pandemic, and all of us, I think collectively, were searching for something to keep ourselves sane and try to find new ways to get those creative juices flowing, I started, to warm to the idea of maybe writing a book. But if we did do a book, what could it be? And that's kind of jumping off point where we then started to lock in on some theories, some ideas, coming up with a little thesis or little pitches and proposals to various ideas or topics that could be a book. And we ultimately landed on this sort of structure that we came up with for We the Raptors. And Nathan, what it's truly rooted in, if anybody in your audience is a basketball fan, a hockey fan, a football fan, a baseball fan, a whatever fan, and if they're from Toronto or Vancouver or Madrid or Miami, it doesn't matter. We all, as sports fans and sports broadcasters and just people in general, love to get into these arguments about who's the top three, who's the top five, who's the top 10. Oftentimes in sports, we'll use the metaphor of who's the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
And with the Raptors, and I don't know if it's necessarily unique just to the Raptors, but with the Raptors, it seems like, and with the Toronto fan base overall, it seems like there is an appreciation for the other guys as much as there is an appreciation for the stars. And when I started to think about the Raptors and the sort of top five Mount Rushmore of Raptors, in my opinion, I don't know if you'd agree or not, but it seems like there is no argument. We could argue over the order, who's first, who's second, who's fifth. But Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, Vince Carter, Kawhi Leonard, Chris Bosh.
Sure.
Those are the five, in my opinion. Now, we could make an argument for a Van Vliet, a Siakam, a Damon Stoudemire, a Tracy McGrady, but they might be top 10, they might be top 15, but the five, to me, are locked in. What about Jonas Valanciunas? What about Norm Powell? What about Antonio Davis and Jerome Williams and Alvin Williams and TJ Ford, and the list goes on, Patrick Patterson, of all these guys that you would go to Air Canada Centre or now Scotiabank Arena, look up in the stands, see people wearing the jerseys of those players, see and hear and watch fans talking openly and glowingly and lovingly about these players that weren't named Kyle or DeMar or Vince or Chris or Kawhi with almost as much reverence as those guys. But yet, when we hear about the Raptors and the stories and the history and the books that are out, more often than not, and again, rightfully so, it focuses on the same 3, 4, 5 guys, and we don't hear the stories of all the others that help build the foundation of the organization and the fan base. And we thought, what if we wrote a book on them? People that still contributed to a lot. And we said to ourselves, this is the only real tie-in to the 30th year anniversary is, could we come up with 30 guys? Could we get 30 players? And that's really the only tie-in to the because we didn't want this to be, with due respect to coffee table books, we didn't want this to be a coffee table book, just a little flip-through book with pictures and whatnot. We wanted it to be a collection of true stories. And that was the genesis of where it started. And then it just kind of all took off from there. And it turned out to be a very popular idea when we were pitching it, and fortunate enough to sign on with Simon and Schuster. And
well, it's so interesting that you say the structure, because I was going to ask you about the structure. And I was going to ask how it emerged, and I'm so delighted to hear that the structure emerged from the feeling of the culture of the team. That the right way to tell the story of the Raptors is through many lenses, and to pull in the stories of the grind guys.
I think that's entirely true. And I think that was part of the attraction for Eric and me. So that if we were going to tell a history of the team, it tends to be a kind of singular perspective, right? This is year 1, year 2, year 3, and you just sort of work your way through. And we thought, well, if we actually focus in on one player each chapter, we get a little bit of that multi-lens perspective. And so it's not one player for every year, it's 30 players, sometimes talking about the same events in team history. And that was really interesting for me, especially as a fan. I know Eric, as a broadcaster with the team and covering the team for so long, he knows a lot of these guys a lot better than I do. He knows a lot more of these stories. He knows a lot more of the ins and outs and the things that could never have made it into the book. But for me as an outsider, I knew the dominant narrative. I knew that year 1, year 2, year 3. And what was interesting to me was hearing guys take those stories and say, oh yeah, that's the story, but here's my take on that, right? Here's what it looked like from my spot on the bench. Here's how it looked like from me standing out at the 3-point line as opposed to being the guy with the ball at the top of the key. And I thought that was a really cool element about focusing in on each of these guys, is you do get that kaleidoscopic effect, right? We're seeing the same stories, but from multiple perspectives.
And the other thing, Nathan, if I can jump on that for a second, is Andrew gets the credit for coming up with the idea of breaking the book up into different eras. So to his point, it wasn't just this happened year 1, this happened year 2, this happened year 6, 7, 12, 14, and et cetera. And it wasn't like that. This was this era of basketball, the expansion era, the Vince era. Then there was, we could call it, as we said in the book, we could call it the Bosch era, or we could call it 7 different things, because it was an era of change and attempted change and trying to morph what they were and trying to get back to the playoffs. And then, of course, there was the championship and beyond era. And we are in the beyond era right now and have been for a number of years now. But in us being able to break up the book into those eras, it was the ability to then focus on certain guys from those pockets in time and not have to go season by season and get one person, and simply tell the greater lens, the bigger picture of those specific eras and the moments that happened within those, 4 or so eras that we kind of laid out within the 30 chapters of the players themselves in the book. So it kind of set a nice structure overall to the way that the book was being given to the reader.
I really love the structure too, because an oral history is great. Love an oral history, but they tend to be linear. The only way to bring in the chorus of voices is to attach them to a linear timeline. And that's lovely, but it also means, for there are fans who jumped on with the championship, and for them, that's they're going to want to skip 2/3 into the book, as opposed to just lock in on one guy. There's, we see Alvin Williams on TV, calling games. So like everyone's always kind of, ribbing him about his time as a Raptor. I want to hear from Alvin about his time as a Raptor. I want to hear about Alvin's experience in the NBA. And I wasn't a fan back then, but that was the first chapter I wanted to read because that's a guy I know, and I wanted to know more about this guy. I love the structure. I love that middle path between oral history and a more like rigid, like coffee table book, like you say, Eric. Because this isn't that. I described it as a feast. It really is. You just kind of, it's more like a buffet, and I just kind of keep going back. How did you wind up picking the players? I mean, you talked about the Mount Rushmore of it all, but 30 is so tidy. 30 ties into the 30th anniversary. Great way to set a deadline. Writers need deadlines. Tell me about settling on the 30 and this batch of 30.
Well, the way I was thinking about it, because we'd get this question, right? How do you pick the 30? And you ask any Raptors fan, this book, they're gonna look at the list of people and say, I love these guys, but where's Mo Pete, right? Where's Jamario Moon, right? They're gonna start listing guys that aren't in the book. And for Eric and me, and we said, this is a book that could have 50 guys, 75, 100 guys, but unfortunately that would be an encyclopedia, not a book.
Right.
And I think our attraction in this project was the opportunity for storytelling itself. I think if we went with that encyclopedia model, or even if we went with just a pure oral history model where we just transcribed the interviews, we would miss some of that narrative element, right? You could transcribe the interviews, you could reorganize them, you could rejigger them, but you don't have the opportunity to do a little bit of the reflecting that I think is really interesting in this project. And I think this is part of the reason why it was so important to have Eric as part of the writing of this book. I'm a fan. I only sort of know the dominant narratives from the outside. Eric was there and he has views on a lot of what happened. He understands it in ways that I think are much more nuanced than maybe sports commentary always allows for. Mm-hmm. And he's also been around the team where, issues that were once in the past come up again and again. And so I think it was really important to have that opportunity to tell a story, to tell those individual stories, to weave them across the four eras, to make them a coherent part of the entire history of the team, but also to make space for Eric's voice in the book to discuss what actually happened from his point of view as well at calling the game.
Who was the first player you got to sit down and talk to you for the purpose of writing this book?
I think it's Jerome Williams.
It was either Jerome or Danny Green, one of the two, I believe.
Oh, you might be right. You know what? And both were great interviews. I think I think of Jerome Williams just because I remember their moment. I think you'll remember it too, Eric. The interview starts and it's a video Zoom interview. And Eric explains to Jerome Williams, who fans might know as the Junkyard Dog, right? A great personality figure from early in the team's history. And Eric says, oh, yeah, and we're going to record this on video as well, not just audio. And Jerome Williams says, video? Oh, this is going to be recorded on video? He says, hold on a sec. And he reaches out a frame and just within arm's reach, pulls down a Toronto Raptors hat, right, and puts it on his head. And I thought that was such a cool moment because it was a sign of how much the Raptors meant to him more than 20 years later, right? He was only with the team for 2 years, but he still was just like, oh, no, Raptors is my team. Like, yeah. I root for the Raptors. This means a lot to me. So I think that was probably the reason why, Eric, it jumped out. But there's equally good reasons from the Danny Green interview, including his account of the parade during the 2019 championship, which are worth remembering.
Yeah, I mean, and it was cool for me, Nathan, to be able to talk to some of these guys as well that either I haven't seen or spoken to in 2 years or in 20 years, and to be able to reminisce about certain stories and to also talk to them from a different perspective versus maybe when I last spoke to them, whether it be in a broadcaster role or in a reporter's role, because I've worn a lot of different hats over the course of my career, and to be able to just kick back and no questions written down. I knew in my brain where I wanted to go with the first question or where I would hope to eventually go, but I wanted to just, as I'm sure you are right now with this conversation, sit back and let the conversation dictate where it all goes for the next 30 minutes or 3 hours. And I would take notes from time to time if there was something I wanted to circle back to, but every single interview was just me kicking back, I wasn't in a suit or anything. We're wearing hats, we're wearing t-shirts. It's the middle of the summer, it's the middle of the winter. It's outside a bar at midnight in Montreal when my phone rings and Chris Childs is calling me to do a follow-up interview because he thought of something else that he wants to talk about. It's wherever I was at the time, and they were all very casual conversations. And I think that lent to, obviously, the guys being more open with sharing. And as much as the current players that are still in the league, RJ Barrett, Garrett Temple, Norm Powell, Jonas Valanciunas, and others, as great as they were, and as open and honest as they were, I think so many of the players that have since retired wanted to talk because they wanted to share their story, or they enjoyed having someone reach out to them again to kind of pull them back into the spotlight. That's something that as a broadcaster, I've talked about many times over the years. I'm sure you've addressed it on your shows in some way, shape, or form, whether it be in basketball or hockey or baseball or any sport, is the transition from being a professional athlete and being in the spotlight and under the microscope, and then suddenly you're retired and you're just a regular Joe now. And you might have a lot of money and there might be a lot of zeros in your bank account, but you're just a regular Joe now, and you don't have that attention every day from whether it be the media or the fans or whatnot. And I think a lot of guys kind of enjoyed reminiscing and telling stories and having that moment, and knowing they were going to be in a book and that it would be kind of on shelves for history, and in this moment in time where they got to tell their version of their life or their life as a Raptor. And I think that kind of also allowed them to open up to another level, which perhaps they maybe didn't as a player, when it was more talking X's and O's and between the lines and not really getting into bigger picture things.
One of the things I really loved, and I think you're touching on this, is the vulnerability that we got with a lot of these guys. And it's not just because it's also not a hot and immediate vulnerability. It's not, how do you feel about the thing that's going to happen to you? Like, you've just been traded. How do you feel about it? Instead, we're getting this reflective these reflective thoughts. Again, I mentioned Alvin Williams because there was a point in the book where I wrote down, like, my note was, you never hear about this. And he was talking about, and this is something that comes up in my house when we're watching sports, and as the dad, I'm supposed to like know stuff and I don't. And the question is, like,
I don't either all the time, not all the time. So.
Right? And it was about Alvin talking about being traded. And how green he was, that he thought, like, oh, I think I'm supposed to, like, okay, but like practice is now, so I'll just go to practice and then I'll pack up and leave. And he realized, like, no, man, you're not on this team anymore. It's over. Like,
yeah, you're not allowed to be here.
You're literally not. You're literally not a member of this team. You're not authorized to be here at practice. And that was, and I loved that. I could take stuff like that all day long, where you get into the business of, like, the job, and where an elite athlete, because what they do in the NBA is magic. Like, nobody can do these things that are like table stakes. And you see, Alvin Williams is this like young dopey guy who doesn't know where he's supposed to be right now. And I love that he shared that.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about getting to those things? Were there things that surprised you that people sort of just dropped in the interview?
The two that stand out, and I could get, well, I'll give you three. I'll give you three. The one real quick one, which was certainly vulnerable, but also very funny, at least in my eyes. But Jonas Valanciunas, coming over from Lithuania and adjusting to life in another continent, let alone in another country, let alone then dealing with the language. And one of the first things he does in going out to find groceries and things for his house is to go to Home Depot, because he figured Home Depot has home goods and things for my house, i.e. groceries and food, and walking around thinking there are tools and lumber. What is this place? I thought this was Home Depot. I thought that was funny. I had never heard that from Jonas before. But on a more serious level, I mentioned Chris Childs. I thought Childs, considering there are guys in this book and guys that I've dealt with over the course of my career, covering the team for almost 30 years, almost the entirety of the organization's history. I knew Chris Childs. I had a working relationship with Chris Childs, but there are other guys that I have gotten to know on a much more personal level, even some that I've become friends and colleagues with that are now working in media. But Chris, it was only ever broadcaster player. And I wouldn't be surprised if, before this book started, if I had walked down Yonge Street, walked by Chris Childs, I'm going to guess he probably wouldn't even recognize me and stop and say hi. To consider how open he was then in the conversation, and to get into discussions about addiction problems and alcohol abuse, and having sort of I don't mean this necessarily in a religious way. I'm just sort of stealing the line, like having his come to Jesus moment with one of his children
Mhm.
being the sort of jumping off point of him to open his eyes as a man, let alone as a father, let alone as an athlete, of I need to get my life together, let alone my career together. For him to come out and admit that and openly admit that, I thought was extremely vulnerable on his behalf. And another guy on a similar vein or path in John Thomas, who, similar to Alvin to some extent, spoke about the craziness and the uncertainty and the confusion of being traded when he thought he finally had a home with the Celtics or with the Knicks, and then he's a Raptor, and then ultimately losing the joy for the sport, leaving the game entirely, and then somehow, some way, magically, and to his credit, his work ethic, found his way back to the NBA. You just spoke about it's hard enough to make the league once. You made it twice,
Yeah.
and to get into how the impact of his father and the relationship with his father and how it was torn for a while and how they reconnected and how he's trying to now use that in his relationship with his kid and with his children, and trying to be a better person, and like all of this stuff goes way beyond my year, my 2, my 5 years with the Raptors and my connection to the Toronto fan base. And that, again, I think is to the credit of the players exposing themselves and being willing to go down certain paths with me, and sort of walked with them down that path if they were willing to go there.
Yeah.
I think as a NBA outsider in some ways, Nathan, you and I are like we're a little bit closer, right? In what surprises us,
Yeah.
which was not just the openness, but learning a little bit more about like, behind the scenes, right? The mechanics of being an NBA player, NBA star, part of a team. And so I was also blown away by the openness with which these players reflected. It seemed to me very honestly, very truthfully about their time with the Raptors and in the NBA. And the player that actually struck me with Alvin as well. Alvin was a great one, but Charlie Villanueva for me was one of the great stories and interviews of the book. He gets drafted as a 21-year-old by the Raptors in 2005, only spends one season with the team. And then when a new general manager comes in at the end of that season, Brian Colangelo, he gets traded to the Bucks, right? And you interview the player today, and they'll say, it's a business, right? You'll always hear that line. It's a business. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? I'm looking forward to being a part of the Bucks. I wish the
Hmm.
Raptors the best, and so on. They leave it at that. And Charlie Villanueva, he said he used a word that was kind of amazing to me. He said it felt like betrayal to him at that moment. And he carried that sense of hurt and betrayal with him, not just for a season or 2 seasons or 3 seasons, but when he went back up as a free agent and the phone rang and he knew it was going to be the Toronto Raptors on the other line saying, "We want to re-sign you," he said, "I can't even take the call." His brother took the call. He says, "I'm not talking to the Raptors. I can't go back there. That's how much it hurts." And that's one part of the honesty. But the other part of the honesty that was so shocking to me about Charlie's story is that years later he said, "You know what? I was wrong about that." Right? He was like a big enough
Hmm.
man to sort of say, like, okay, like I knew cognitively it was a business, but it was hard for me to believe emotionally it's just a business. And he says, now I kind of regret it. Maybe I should have gone back to Toronto after those 3 years. I love Toronto. I got a son in Toronto. I love visiting Toronto, like all of these things. And he even sort of forgives Brian Colangelo, the guy who traded him away from the place he learned to love the first time he was an NBA player. And he said, actually, I kind of see why Brian Colangelo traded me away. I kind of see why he traded me to the Bucks. And in fact, it's probably my own fault. I scored 48 points against the Bucks that year, so obviously they wanted me, right? It's like it's such a great story, but it's a story about like reflection, honesty, openness, and I think that for me was so refreshing in an era of canned sound bites after games.
Yeah. One of the things also a theme throughout this book is so many of these players, like Jonas Valanciunas, this guy's 7 feet tall, standing in Home Depot, wondering where he can get milk, um, which I loved. I recall reading that chapter. I was eating a shawarma and I choked on it at that point. Um, for a lot of these guys, being being traded to the Raptors, being drafted by the Raptors, was It's a mission to Mars. It was like you're going to Toronto. What's a Toronto? What do I need to do? I don't know anything. The, what I really loved though was as you said for so many players, and then Toronto then becomes home,
Hmm.
and they become attached to that. Eric, you'd be talking to these guys courtside. Did you see, like, was that something you could kind of see as that like very human comfort settling in over time? You're talking to a guy when he's brand new, and then it's the end of the season and he just feels differently. He feels different in the building.
The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
The longer answer is winning cures all. So
Yeah.
it certainly helps. Like, listen,
Yeah.
hopefully nobody. Well, actually, no. Nathan, I want everybody listening to this wherever they are. So I was going to say, hopefully nobody in Oklahoma City hears this, but I'll just say it anyways. Oklahoma City is not exactly a great destination. My apologies to the tourism board of Oklahoma City. I've been there a number of times. Great people, nice people, great arena, loud arena, one of the toughest places even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. But would you be circling Oklahoma City on the map as a hotspot destination to go if you were an NBA player and specifically an NBA free agent? I would say no. Probably at least 75%, if not 95%, no. But when they got Shea Gilgeous-Alexander and they've got the reigning MVP and they're the reigning champs and they've got a pretty good core with an Alex Caruso and a Lou Dort and a Chet Holmgren and the list goes on, suddenly now Oklahoma City.
Let's pack up and go to OKC.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when you're a Toronto Raptors team or a New York Knicks team or Chicago Bulls team for years, literally decades plus after Michael Jordan, struggling to find relevance, struggling to find consistency, struggling to find wins, struggling to find postseason berths, I think that when you start finding it and you start winning, the winning cures all. And I could go off on a long tangent on this, Nathan, but I think what I've said, and I know my broadcast partner and I, Paul Jones, we've talked about this a ton, whether it be on broadcast or on talk shows that we've done and podcasts and everything else, is if you were to take a look at the Eastern Conference, heck, for that matter, a good chunk of the Western Conference, more than 50% of the NBA is played in cities where it's cold and it snows. It didn't seem to matter to Michael Jordan that it was freezing as all hell in the windy city Chicago, where the weather is, I would argue, at least as bad, if not worse than Toronto, because they were winning. They were winning championships. Didn't seem to matter to Larry Bird and the Celtics with the bad weather and the snow and whatnot that you get in Boston, or the New York Knicks back in the day. And I could go on again, go through the list. Kevin Garnett, now great, he didn't crack through as much as he wanted to in Minnesota, but Minnesota? Are you kidding me? But somehow, some way, it always seems like, ooh, Toronto.
Yeah.
The big bad North, the great white North. Ooh, it's cold. But does anybody ever take a chance to look at a map and to see geographically where Toronto is versus where some of those, northeastern cities and states are, or even some in the Pacific Northwest and whatnot, or the Midwest and whatnot? I think there's just a stigma, but I think the longer the Raptors have been around, that has helped bust the stigma. I think the more success that the Raptors had helped bust the stigma. And no better example, at least from this book, than a guy like Patrick Patterson, who gets traded from Sacramento, where he doesn't necessarily want to be, but at the same time, he thinks he's maybe kind of finally found a home with the Kings, and he's in Northern California, and he gets traded to Toronto in December and wants no part of going to Toronto, wants to get out of there and rerouted, retraded as quickly as humanly possible, only to then find out about 3 months later that the Raptors found lightning in a bottle and found some kind of magic that season, flipped their year on its head, finished as one of the top 3-5 teams in the entire league over the final half of the season. And Patrick Patterson wanted to re-sign a contract, did re-sign a contract, stayed long-term with the Raptors, never wanted to leave Toronto, ended up marrying a Canadian girl, and now has a child with dual citizenship. Like, those are the examples of guys where it can change like that. And why or how? Winning cures all.
Oh, I got to jump in though, Eric.
Please
Listen,
do.
as a GTA Toronto guy, you're killing my heart here, right? But I think one of the things Nathan's also pointing to though, less so now, right? Now, guys are coming in and out of Toronto all the time on other teams, right? They know the city. Drake's there, great nightlife, all the usual stuff. They always talk about what is it, South Beach flu when guys go to Miami, have a good time out before a game. I think there's probably a Lake Ontario flu that it exists just a little bit. But again,
Absolutely.
thinking back to Patrick Patterson, you're totally right. The team starts winning. He says, this looks pretty good. But the other thing was springtime showed up in Toronto, right?
It's a great
And
point.
he was
Yeah.
like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Where were all of these people, right? And we all know this as Torontonians.
Yep.
You start to kind of hunker down a little bit. You say, okay, let's hope for an early spring, March, April kind of thing. And he saw that people were outside, they were vibing out, there was more street parties. So that was something kind of peculiar to Toronto, at least historically, right? They discover it was this vibrant city that isn't always so present in the winter. And then a leitmotif of the book that Eric and I noted again and again was one thing Toronto has
Well, I
that
know where you're
almost
going.
every, yeah, you know where I'm going with this. You know what? And I'll set you up. What's the
Yeah.
one thing Toronto has that almost every player pointed to as this is one of the dopest things about this city? What is it, Eric?
Caravana, Caravana, and more Caravana.
You
It was
betcha.
like almost, if it wasn't every guy, it was at least half the guys in the book, Nathan. It was, yeah. And then I came for a workout in July, or I was there in June, or I came there in August. And man, the weather and the women and the restaurants and the nightlife and Caravana, Caravana, Caravana. I mean, and listen to that point that you bring up as well, Nathan, that Andrew just hit on, and it is perfect. I think Patrick might even said something to the effect of like, it's like the carpet was rolled out in March and all of a sudden
Mm.
people were back again, and then the carpet gets rolled up in, Novemberish or whatever. We don't often hear about this with the Toronto Blue Jays. I
No.
mean, the season starts in April, so it's still, I guess, a little bit coolish, and it ends, well, hopefully in late October, early
Yeah,
November
I
every
should I
year.
should just
But
I should date stamp
you
this
know,
for listeners because this episode is going to go out after the conclusion of the World Series, and
right.
Yep.
as we speak right now, the three of us are speaking on the travel day as the Blue Jays return to Toronto to finish this series. However, it's got to go. I'm not jinxing anything, but that's the state of suspense that we three are in right now. Just for listeners who are wondering why we don't know the obvious outcome.
And that's why I was even trying to keep it generic, saying we just hope they play into late October, early November
Yeah,
every year.
yeah.
But we don't hear about it. Why? Because the bulk of it is May, June, July, August, September, 5 months when the weather's gorgeous and everything's great, and there are no snowstorms and there's no de-icing of an airplane and all that stuff. But to Andrew's point, I could give you Kevin Garnett and I believe Kobe before he passed. I mean, Paul Pierce. The list goes on of top players over the years that when they're asked about their favorite NBA cities, I know Zion Williamson was recently quoted as saying the same thing. Guy after guy after guy, not to try and tie in our theme of top five, top three, whatever, Mount Rushmore, but Toronto is on the Mount Rushmore all the time. Guys love coming here. The difference is, though, they like coming here to visit.
Mm.
Do they like coming here to stay? To stay is different. And I still say, even though Andrew's not arguing with me, but he's bringing up another kind of alternate point. I still think it's rooted in winning. Because even if that weather's nice, if you're not winning, it doesn't feel as good no matter where you are. You could be in Miami. If you're losing, it doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
I think winning cures all.
Yeah. I'll also make a note for folks outside of the GTA for whom Caravana is, maybe it's the first time you've heard that word. It's a massive street festival celebrating all kinds of Caribbean cultures. There's food,
Yes.
there's music. It's incredible, and it is a unique thing that we can take for granted here in the GTA when we just get upset that like the lakeshore is closed or whatever. But like it's kind of an awesome thing that happens in the city of Toronto.
It's amazing.
You talked a little bit earlier about that experience of clinging to the league, barely like the kind of these are stories I love, is the story of the professional athlete who is barely professional. And it's not for lack of talent and it's not for lack of skill. It seems to, in almost every case, it seems to be they just haven't found the team that can use what they bring. And so they find themselves traded here, there, not even within a league. They're in Europe for a spell. And I really loved the chapter about Garrett Temple. He's got a unique story. Can you tell me a little bit about putting that in the book? Because I do love the role he plays and how he tells about it.
when you think about a guy like Garrett Temple, this is this. Hopefully, if he hears this, this is not meant in any way in a disrespectful manner. I think some people may look at it and say, "Okay, explain to me why Garrett Temple is in this book specifically." I don't, and it's not for it's not for a lack of popularity,
Mm-hmm.
but he wouldn't necessarily be front of mind maybe for a lot of Raptor fans right now saying, "Oh yeah, Garrett Temple is a fan favorite." Garrett Temple is a player favorite of the current team. And that's why he got included, because of the importance that he plays with this current squad. And it was a sort of last minute thing when we were looking at like who are some other guys that we could look at. And as soon as I heard Grady Dick, who was then a rookie, speaking at the end of his rookie season about which player had the most impact on you this season, Garrett Temple. Unprompted, 10, 15 minutes later at the same sort of locker cleano press conference, unprompted in talking about something else, Scotty Barnes, when waxing poetic about I don't even know what, happened to tie into his answer. And I got to say, I can't talk enough about Garrett Temple and how important it was to have that vet, my vet, in my ear all the time throughout the season and showing me the way both on and off the court. And right away, both Andrew and I said, Garrett Temple's got to be in this book. Because his impact on this current team, as we try to again branch those eras and use this last era as the jumping off point to, hey, what comes next? Let's wait and see. This seems like a no-brainer to have this guy. But then when you dig beyond it, as again we tried to do in each one of these chapters, the Garrett Temple story, as you just laid out perfectly, Nathan, is so intriguing with the history of his grandfather, the history of his father, the history of his family in Louisiana, but then his history of trying to make the NBA, literally scratching and clawing to just get a 10-day contract, to get a tryout, to get a look.
Yeah.
And then when it finally did happen, here's a dude that has now been in the league for almost 20 years. And it barely, by the skin of his teeth, happened.
Yeah.
And he made it happen. And here he is almost 2 decades later. And in fact, this current role with the Raptors as a player wasn't even supposed to be or look the way it does. He was originally called by Darko Rajakovic, the head coach of the Raptors, to be an assistant coach. And then Masai Ujiri, the then president of the Raptors, stepped in and helped facilitate a player's role for Garrett because Garrett wasn't prepared to leave and retire quite yet. And he felt that his impact and his voice on this team would be felt greater from the viewpoint as a fellow player and not as a former player who's now a coach. And hence the reason he was able to then sign another deal, which he's currently in right now, and still not step into retirement and still be the guy that can put on the jersey, put on the shorts, put on the shoes and be there as a player and not on the other side as a coach. And I think it just speaks to his work ethic and how he has grinded over the course of his lifetime to get to where he is and to continue to have a job. Because I'll tell you, Nathan, if I mean, people in your audience that are basketball fans are going to know this, but if you're just a kind of casual fan on the periphery, there are less than 500 NBA jobs in the world, 8 billion people. And let's just say, for argument's sake, 500 NBA players. Yet every year there are 2 rounds in the draft. There are 30 players. Of those 60 players drafted, I would argue at least 35 play in the league. So do the math. I'm horrible at math, as Andrew knows, but I quickly off the top of my head, I would say that 10% of 500 is 50 guys, right? And you've got 35. So you're talking about somewhere in about the neighborhood of about a 7 to 8% turnover of the league every year. Yeah. So there are probably 35 guys in the NBA right now that will not be in the league when we speak again next year. If we speak again next year.
Yeah. Whether they know it or not.
Garrett Temple's still there standing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
After almost 20 years. That says something about him as a person, let alone as a player.
I'm a huge NBA fan. And before doing this book, I didn't know that much about Garrett Temple, either personally or even professionally to some extent. Right. So, but it's really clear how much he means to that Raptors team. I was, in fact, at the Raptors game just last night when they were playing Houston, and I'm sitting up at the front row in the 300s looking down on the Raptors bench. And Colin Murray-Bowles, fouls somebody, gets pulled out of the game, heads over to the bench. who's the first guy to stand up, right? It's Garrett Temple. And they're not even watching the game at this point. Game's going on behind them. And Garrett Temple is in his face being like, listen, bud, that's like a tough defensive assignment. I don't know what he's saying, right? But he's tapping his chest. And then he starts kind of grabbing him and moving him and being like, this is how you put your body, right? Like you put it up like this, right? He was a defensive specialist. He knows how to do this. And he talked to him for a good 2 minutes. And Colin's standing there nodding his head, right? He's being like, yeah, you're right. You're right. That's it. That's right. You're right. And then Garrett, gives him a smack on the chest and he says, go get him like next time, right? And
Mm.
that really matters to these young players, these new players. And it's easy to miss that as a fan, right? It's easy not to see that value. And I think part of it was for me again, I didn't know Garrett's career that well. When Garrett was running down all the teams he played for Eric during the interview, I was just like, I need a spreadsheet to keep this straight. I still can't keep it straight. It's been such a complicated career. And I pulled up his Wikipedia page just to kind of jog my memory, and it's breathtaking, right? He starts with the Rio Grande Valley Vipers, not a season with Houston, not a season with Sacramento, try out with the Spurs for a bit, back down to the Vipers, over to the Erie Bayhawks, a little bit of time with the Bucks, back to the Bayhawks, Bobcats, to Italy, to Reno, and then finally gets a toehold with the Wizards in Washington, right? And then you see his career really start to develop from there. But that guy, man, he is a grinder, right? Like he stuck with it and he had the full support of his family, said to just like keep doing it. And he went from an undrafted guy whose job was to be the defensive assignment during basically like
Pre-draft
team
workouts. Yeah.
pre-draft workouts, right? So Steph Curry comes in, they're like, we want to draft Steph Curry. So they're like, get that Garrett Temple guy to guard him. We'll see if it's any good. And from there, Garrett starts to get a look and starts to get some shots up, playing in D League and stuff like that. And, he develops a career out of that. So it's kind of an amazing story. But I also hope that this chapter offers insight into the personality and character of Garrett Temple and why the Raptors wanted him so badly as a part of this team and probably as a part of that coaching bench into the future.
I think, Nathan, that and listen, I'll come back and eat my words if I'm wrong. Whether it's in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, Garrett Temple's a head coach in the NBA. Like he has that kind of personality, that kind of makeup and DNA that he will be a head coach in the NBA. If he wants to be, he'll have a job.
Yeah.
Period.
I think that he's so relatable in that I think, we watch when we watch sports, most of us, with, the exception of you, Eric, you have a strange job. It looks like fun. But most of us are watching sports. Andrew and I are watching sports because that's leisure. That's what we are not doing our jobs. Our jobs are over for the day and we're watching sports. But it's a workplace. We're watching people at work. And it is a unique workplace, and we get so much of that through this book. And we learn things like workouts. Once I learned about workouts and that like Garrett's an in-demand workout guy, I thought, oh wow, you could wind up knowing like half the guys playing the All-Star game without getting a single minute on the court during a regular season game, because this is a job. This is one of the jobs to do. I love that. I also love, I'll say, we talked about grind guys. I love Norm Powell. I'm so glad you had a chapter on Norm Powell. I bring him up because he's a member of the bench mob. And I want to ask more about, tell me about the bench mob. And I want to know because they feel emblematic of the scrappiness and kind of like high emotional intelligence, positive attitude kind of thing that this current that seems to run beneath this team.
I think they're a great example, maybe a poetic example of the overarching theme of this book, of the grind players and the role players and whatnot, because the grind players and the role players, I even, Andrew and I'm going to divert for one quick little second here. Andrew and I went back and forth on this a number of times, even with the folks at Simon & Schuster and whatnot, because I felt as though that some people, not naming names, some people were using grinders and role players as with almost a negative connotation,
like a pejorative term.
It's not the stars, it's the grinders, it's the muckers, it's the grind. Like, no, you can be a role player and still be a starter on a team. You can be a role player and be the sixth man. You can be a role player and be an all-star or win an end of the season award and be like all of these guys that started as part of the bench mob. When we think about the core guys, Fred VanVleet, who went on to sign a $90 million contract and is a starting point guard before unfortunately getting hurt with the Houston Rockets now, or Pascal Siakam, a multi-time All-Star who was just in the finals last year, unfortunately losing with the Pacers after obviously tasting the championship victory in 2019 with the Raptors. A guy like a Norm Powell. So many of these people now, like Norm is a key cog in what the Miami Heat are hoping to do this season, but they came up through the Raptors development system. They played at Raptors 905. They weren't thrust into the spotlight right away. Like we see in the National Football League, especially with quarterbacks and running backs and maybe wide receivers. It's certainly on the offensive end. Hey, we spent a lot of money on you, a high draft pick. You're going, you're starting. There isn't that time to develop. And I think for these guys, it really hardened them early on in terms of knowing that I might be playing 2 games in one day. I'm playing with the 905 on an afternoon game, and I'm playing with the Raptors that night. I'm coming off the bench. I'm learning behind DeRozan. I'm learning behind Kyle Lowry. I'm picking and choosing my spots of when I can make an impact on this game. I'm getting a spot start here and there because somebody else is hurt. And then maybe the next week I'm back down to the G League again. And I think that made them better people, but certainly better players overall, and turned them into the types of players that they now are because of the grind that they had with this team. And I think there are so many examples of that goes back to not only the bench mob, but even if we look back even further, and Andrew, maybe you can take the baton on this too, is when we think back to when, you had Amir Johnson coming off the bench with Sonny Weems, or with, back in the day with Jarrett Jack, and we had the t-shirts that existed back then. There've been all these little pockets and all these little cultures of Raptors through the years of guys that kind of built themselves up within the system.
And I think it's also, one of the nice things about focusing on these non-all-star players is you get to see sometimes some pretty unpredictable career trajectories. And Norman Powell's a great example, right? From being this guy who's bouncing back and forth to all of a sudden being a really critical cog, especially last season with the Los Angeles Clippers, right? Scoring 20 plus points a game and everything. And I think if you go back to that bench mob, right, and it's a bench unit, but it's testament to how the Raptors organization has developed talent and how they've cannily brought in veterans at the right time and found these sort of young guys and turned them into really, really valuable players. So on that bench mob, right, depending on how you define it, you got CJ Miles, who they brought in as a, canny vet. But then you also had Fred VanVleet, another guy who had to leave Toronto. Why? Because he got a mega contract going from, somebody who was, again, on the bench, maybe not so secure, to becoming an essential part of that team, an essential part of early Raptors playoff teams. DeLon Wright, Pascal Siakam, right, just went to the NBA Finals with Indiana as like basically one of their 2 big or 3 players. And Jakob Poeltl, a player who's now on the Raptors, got traded away, came back. And Eric can testify to this, calling the game last night against Houston. Who's our size? Who's our center? Who we need on this current team, right? And all of those guys are testament to how the Raptors develop talent, how they identify it, and how so many of these stories about guys who are now really essential fixtures in the league start with guys who are, on the trash heap, guys who aren't drafted, guys who only end up in the G League, right? If developed, if given a chance, they really can turn into not just quality bench players, but starting quality figures at the absolute highest level in the NBA.
Nathan, you're going to have to check me on this one, or just keep it in as is if I'm right. And I know it's embarrassing to admit that I'm brain cramping and vapor locking on this, but if I'm not mistaken, the stat or the story was back in 2019 with the Raptors is that I believe was the first and maybe to this day still only team that didn't have a top 10 draft pick on its roster, certainly not in its starting 5. And that, again, speaks to the development of this team and so many of the guys that even became stars. Kyle Lowry was not a top 3, top 5 Mount Rushmore when he came to Toronto. He turned himself into that. There were a lot of people that doubted what DeMar DeRozan could or would be. And he morphed himself and changed himself year after year and brought something else to the season, another tool in his bag, another weapon to choose each year with the way that he would develop his shooting, his three-point shooting, his handle, his rebounding, his defensive skills, whatever it might be. There's so many guys that you could think of over the course of this team that started out kind of in the shadows and through their own work and opportunity thrust themselves into that spotlight and made themselves better than perhaps other people thought they would be or could be.
There's so many guys, as you say. There's a lot of guys in this book. It's fun. Eric, Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for reading the book, engaging with it. Right, like I know it means a lot to both Eric and me.
Yeah, I appreciate you having us on, and thanks for the conversation. It was a lot of fun.
I have been speaking with Eric Smith and Andrew Bricker, authors of We the Raptors, 30 Players, 30 Stories, 30 Years. Find it at Kobo in Conversations home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. That makes it easy. Follow us in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, do like Kyle Lowry and pass it right through the defense of your favorite sports following book lover. Kobo in Conversation was produced and hosted this time by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.